This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
One of those segments where we always learn so much. So turn up your volume. We did indicate to you earlier on that this is one of those conversations that's often swept under the rug, that we often don't address, but it's absolutely crucial for us to have these conversations. But of course, not just to have the conversation, but to know which pertinent points to address. Welcome to the Family Hub. It's where we focus on all things impacting family, and one such thing that's really crucial is the importance of concluding a Muslim marriage contract and or an antenuptial contract before getting married. In studio now with us we have Camilla Paulson. Now Camilla is a director at Herald Gay Attorneys, and she heads up the family and matrimonial department. Assalamu alaikum and welcome, Camilla. Shukran for joining us.
Assalamu alaikum and thank you for having me, Khadija.
And then also Fatima Isop, Advocate Fatima Isop, that we've had in studio now a few times, and of course founder member. We've given your bio and it's going to take us a while to get through everybody's bio, but now we want to remind our listeners that of course we spoke to Fatima as one of the founder members of the Muslim Family Law Hub. Fatima, assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Wa alaikum salam, Khadija, and thank you again for having us on air this morning.
Now, let's start off the conversation by asking the question, what is a Muslim marriage contract and what's an antenuptial contract, Camilla?
Well, I think we'll start with Fatima.
I'll speak to the Muslim marriage, and
Okay.
Kamala will speak to the South African antenuptial and other matrimonial regimes.
Okay.
So Khadija, the last time we had the show, we took people through the website, and we thought this morning we take them specifically through one or two questions under the marriage tab on the Muslim Family Law website. So if people have their phones with them, you can access the Muslim Family Law Hub website, and under the tab of marriage under Islam, it says what is a Muslim marriage and which kind of conditions can I include in my marriage contract. So to the first question, a Muslim marriage is a sacred bond, but it's also a contract between parties with an offer and acceptance, and you can basically include any conditions in that contract as long as those conditions don't contradict Islamic principles.
Okay.
And so if I can highlight, and then of course there's the South African matrimonial regimes, which Kamila will speak to shortly. But from an Islamic perspective, the Muslim marriage contract is obviously the offer and the acceptance between two adults in the presence of two witnesses, adult male witnesses. And the parties to that contract historically in South Africa generally just have the oral agreement at the nikah ceremony. But what we encourage is that parties, before they actually enter into the nikah, they have discussions about the conditions that they want to include in their marriage contract, and that they actually have that written up.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can, today I only want to highlight three. There are many conditions that you can include, but if I can emphasize two conditions that parties should include in the Muslim marriage contract, it's the following, right? The mahar.
Mm-hmm.
Now, historically in South Africa, women would only ask for a small mahar as a symbolic amount.
Mm-hmm.
Over the years, so I know my mother had asked for a 50 rand.
Yes.
But over the years, that has changed.
In 'n hard tyd was 50 rand eintlik baie geld.
That's right. But now we encourage, and normally what would happen is they'd ask for the mahar up front.
Yes.
But in Islamic law, you can ask for a mahar, part of it up front, and part of it you can ask to be deferred to a later date. And this is not necessarily a custom or urf in South Africa, in Cape Town, but I would strongly encourage women who negotiate their mahar to consider this, to ask for an amount. They can ask for a symbolic amount, or people ask for the Kruger or whatever upfront, but then to also say, ask for a deferred amount. So for instance, the 1,000 rand or 10,000 rand upfront when we conclude the marriage contract, but the deferred amount would be on death or divorce, half the value of the immovable property must be registered in my name as the wife. Right? Or whatever she can ask, whatever it is, as part of her deferred. So the deferred dowry is securing her, provides her with some form of financial security. So that's the first thing I would strongly encourage because it's the woman who has to ask for a dowry.
Yes.
And I would strongly encourage women and advise them, ask for an upfront amount, especially if your future spouse can't afford a large amount. It can be symbolic, or it can be a Krugerrand, whatever you decide, the two of you. But then also include in your marriage contract that you want a deferred dowry of which will provide you with some level of financial security, whether it be half share in the house, whether it be the family home registered in your name at the point of death or divorce, that you can also put in your contract.
Okay.
So that's important.
That's the first one, yes.
That's the first one. The second one that I would strongly encourage, especially once again, women to include in the contract, and I will explain why, is the delegated divorce. Or in Islamic law, it's called talaq tafweed. Now, as we've explained before, in Islamic law, the husband has the right of the unilateral talaq. So he can come into the room and say, I talaq you, and your marriage is over. You, as the wife, if you want a divorce, generally in Cape Town or South Africa, the woman has to go apply for a fasakh to a ulama body, or she can try and negotiate a khula, and then she has to give back to the husband either a dowry or some kind of compensation. The talaq tafweed, however, is when the husband says, I delegate my right of talaq to you. And that means that, and she can negotiate that at the start of nikah. Or she can ask a wakil, a guardian, this is what, daddy, this is what you must ask my future husband, that he delegates his right of divorce, talaq, to me. Because that gives her the same rights as her husband to end the marriage on the basis of issuing a talaq. So that's the second one.
Okay. Let's just understand that correctly. So yes, we know, and we spoke about this the last time that you were here. The idea of the whole, the idea around, as you explained, the various. I mean, the process that entails divorce. So what you explain now, this talaq tafweed, does it mean then that the wife has equal in terms of the rights?
That's right.
So we, as a man, usually in terms of what we know, conventionally speaking, he can say that he divorces his wife.
Yes. So if he delegates,
and she can say the same. And I just want to complete, because I remember when you spoke about the whole, then you said then that means she forfeits her mahar.
Yes.
With this, does she also forfeit her mahar?
No. So that's the thing. And she can make it, they can agree to have it conditional or unconditional. So she can say, if my husband enters into a subsequent marriage, then I will have the delegated right to end the marriage through a talaq. Or she can make it completely unconditional, that the husband delegates his unconditional right of talaq to his wife, and that means at any point during the marriage, if she wants out of the marriage, then she can exercise the right of talaq and pronounce the talaq in the same way that the husband does, without having to compensate or give back her dowry. So it's basically equalizing the right to talaq, and it's an accepted classical form of divorce in Islamic law.
That's so interesting. I mean, when we started these conversations with yourself from the Muslim family law, we said that, and I just mentioned it now again, that a lot of these conversations are uncomfortable. That's simply because we're not familiar with all of these. And so we often frown and say, wat's wat 'n vroue sê? Hoe kan sy vir 'n huis vra, die ander man kan dit nie.
You're starting out on the most exciting part of your life. You're in love.
Yeah.
Everything looks rosy. And now you're asking these complicated questions.
Yeah, and we frame it as somber.
And you are often frowned upon because you are seen as greedy, you are seen as unreasonable, and our mothers and great-grandmothers and great-grandmothers, they didn't ask for this. So what's wrong with this new age millennial, asking these strange things?
Vrouwensrechte en so aan.
Etc., etc. So these are very important questions to ask, because what Fatima and I see are the consequences.
Thereof. Yes.
And what we see are women getting thrown out onto the street with their children, having nothing to show for 20 years of marriage, 30 years of marriage. So these, for young people, and not just for young people, anybody entering marriage, these are very important questions that you need to take into account.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It really is important when we open up this conversation, of course, speaking about, and we would love to hear your comments now around that, Camilla, when we spoke about the fact that we find ourselves as South Africans, of course, at this juncture, at this intersection between South African law, yourself and Fatima, what you're aware of in terms of that. But then we said, what is almost, so there's something clinical about the law in that sense. But then when we speak about Islamic law, oftentimes our religiosity is questioned. Both of you have just alluded to that. And then it becomes very sensitive, because what kind of a woman, what kind of a Muslim am I? Whereas it is within my rights.
Absolutely.
Hence, this as an educational tool, the Muslim family law, why it's so important, because we need to sometimes detach the emotion from it, even though, as you say, it is an incredible time of our life.
It's the most important, and it's your marriage contracts is one of the most important document you're ever going to sign in your life. It is the single most important document you are going to sign, besides your will.
Besides your will, that's right.
And I remember you saying
it is the most
That's
important
right.
document, and there is unfortunately a bias, that exists, and we need to educate people to say there is nothing wrong with understanding your rights. There is nothing wrong with asking for financial security. Absolutely nothing wrong. There's nothing un-Islamic about it.
That's right. And the other thing, I think we spoke about this last time, is that, as Kamla said, many times, especially women, they feel because of that cultural, societal pressure, they don't feel comfortable asking for these rights. My advice to women, whoever is entering a marriage, is you have a wakil. Ask your wakil to negotiate on your behalf with your future spouse, or with the family of your future spouse, because that's the job of the wakil. If you don't feel comfortable negotiating these kind of provisions, then ask your wakil to do that for you. And then of course, the reason we're saying include the talaq tafweed, because as Kamla correctly says, we see the point many times when a woman is in a very difficult, abusive marriage, very, very often the husband refuses to give the talaq. And so then she has to struggle to exit the marriage. I mean, last week I spoke to women from Gauteng, to women from Gauteng, and they were saying how very difficult it is for women in Gauteng to exit a marriage. And especially if the husband doesn't want to grant the talaq. So we see this, and this is why we encourage women. You can resolve that by upfront saying, grant me also the delegated right of talaq.
Unfortunately, what happens in practice is a man says, and unfortunately it is often the man, and he says, you agree to this, and then I give you a talaq. And so it puts the woman in a very difficult position where she doesn't really have a choice. She's in an abusive marriage. It's very difficult to live from a day-to-day basis, being beaten, being emotionally abused, etc., etc. And you're desperate to get out. Your emotions, you're at an all-time low, and you're given an out. But there's an ultimatum. You must agree to this. You don't take the children, you don't get a house, you don't get anything, you just take your bags and you leave, and then I give you a talaq. So that puts her in a very difficult position. What does she do? For her own peace of mind, she's forced to sometimes accept those very unreasonable terms simply to get out of an often abusive marriage.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I mean, Kamla can speak to this. So the Muslim marriage contract is obviously, like we've said before, as Muslims, we're a minority in a South African context. So the Muslim marriage contract is an agreement that you two can negotiate before you get married. But in addition to that, you can also enter into an anti-nuptial contract. And maybe Kamla can speak to what that entails as a Muslim couple, because and maybe Kamla to just explain the 3 kind of systems if you decide to register a marriage under South African law. Maybe just explain to the listeners what the 3 systems are.
I know that Fatima wanted to touch on 3 topics, and she wanted to touch on the mahar, she wanted to touch on the talaq tafweed, which is the delegated talaq, and she also wanted to touch on a 3rd topic, which is the concept of mediation. So those are 3 things that are very important for women to take into account, to understand, to consider, and to, if they don't feel comfortable, ask whether it's their father, whoever that person is, their representative, to relay that information to the husband's family and say, this is what I would like to include.
Yes, Kamla, can I just say on that why we also say that? So we tell women, so it's the mahar, like I said, the talaq tafweed, and include a provision which stipulates that before either party considers issuing a talaq, if you've managed to secure the talaq tafweed, or before the husband issues a talaq, parties have to enter into some form of mediation. And the reason we say this is because if a woman wants a fasakh, for instance, right, the husband refuses to give a talaq, now you end up going to the ulama body to apply for a fasakh. They say the husband must come to the counseling before they can even consider. Oftentimes men refuse to. They don't believe they need counseling. They refuse to come to counseling. Aside from the counseling, if you try and resolve, because it's such a sensitive issue, you don't necessarily want to be going to court to litigate it.
Of course.
What you want to first try and solve it is through some form of alternative dispute resolution, and mediation is that form of alternative resolution. And so you can stipulate, and very often a woman will come to me and say she wants to mediate her matter, but the husband refuses. And mediation has to be through 2 consenting parties. So you can stipulate in your contract that before or during the process of divorce, both parties agree to subject themselves to mediation, because that sets the stage if anything should go wrong within the marriage.
Yeah. We mentioned the fact from the very beginning when we started the series that Muslims find themselves at this intersection. There's South African law, which of course trumps everything, and then we have Muslim law, Muslim personal law as well. And our awareness of both of these is imperative, particularly, like as you said, when you sign or when you embark on this most important contract of all. And of course, it's a contract that's lived, that you're going to be living through for a long, long time. It's a contract that's the starting point of the cornerstone of society. It's this microcosm of society. So you want to start it on the right note, in terms of the emotive aspects, in terms of all of that being in place, the things that we know as Muslims that we want to have in place, but also legally speaking, we want to be realistic about this. So when we speak about this anti-nuptial contract, Kamila, take us through that.
So, Khadija, an anti-nuptial contract is a contract that an intended husband and wife enters into. And they usually sit down with an attorney and they decide what kind of marital regime they are going to enter into in terms of South African law. And there are 3 kinds of marital regimes. The first is in community of property. Now that is the default system in South Africa. So if you went to the Department of Home Affairs and you wanted to, and very often with Muslims in our community, they are often only required to enter into a civil marriage when they're going overseas, when they're going on Hajj. It's not something that they consider. When Muslims get married, we often make an appointment with the sheikh. We go for lessons, we go for counseling with the sheikh, we discuss with the sheikh, and that's it. We don't consider a civil contract. We don't even consider South African law. And the first time it is often brought to our attention is when we need to travel overseas. It is when there are certain formalistic requirements, and then we think, oh, now we need to tick this box in order to go on Hajj, or we need to tick this box in order to do this. And then off we go to the Department of Home Affairs and we get married. And when you don't discuss the marital regime, you make an appointment, you get married, and the default system in South Africa is in community of property. Okay. And that often happens. And there have been many, many stories where people don't realize what it means. And then only on death or divorce does it become a real issue.
I was going to ask you that. In your experience, do people even know?
They don't even know.
They don't know. And so there was this, I digress, but there was a situation where this is exactly what happened to a couple. They wanted to go on Hajj together. One of the boxes they needed to tick was you need to get civilly married because of certain formalistic requirements. Off they went to the Department of Home Affairs. The default system in South Africa is in community of property, sat before a marriage officer, tick, tick, sign, register, and off they went on Hajj. Yeah. Many, many years later, the husband decided he wants to talak the wife. And then they realized that they were married civilly and also needed to get divorced in a civil court. And he did not want to provide her with 50% of his estate because he felt that it was simply a formalistic requirement and he didn't know what he entered into.
And for him, it was a means to an end, to go on Hajj.
To go on Hajj.
Maybe to just explain that in community, the assets of both parties are automatically pooled and they own 50% in that estate, each party.
Okay, but that applies to the debt as well.
Unfortunately,
that's right. It's very important.
It's very important. And so it becomes a joint kitty, and you own 50% of everything, but including the liabilities, so the debt. Right? And it's only a great system if there's lots of assets.
Of course.
It's not a great system when there's lots of liabilities or your husband's business is in trouble and there's lots of people knocking on the door.
Yes, of course.
For large sums of money outstanding, and they can sell everything, including what belongs to the wife, and they will be jointly and severably liable. So it's not a system that we encourage because there are lots of dangers with this kind of system. So
and then to just interject at this point, sorry Kamala, is that the ulama bodies have actually said that it's contrary to the Sharia. They have said that marrying in community of property, precisely because of this concept of one party can't be liable for the debts of another. And so they have, there's an MJC fatwa saying that in community of property is contrary to Sharia. So that's why we encourage parties to conclude
an anti-nuptial contract. Okay. But if anybody in South Africa, whether Muslim or not, you went to a marriage officer and you got married, that would be the default system.
That's right.
If you do not enter into an anti-nuptial contract. So we encourage people to enter into an anti-nuptial contract. Yeah. What that means is that husband and wife have two separate estates. What belongs to the husband is the husband's, and what belongs to the wife is the wife, belongs to the wife. And there is also, so that is out of community of property with no accrual. Then there is a caveat to that. And there's been a recent case in the Constitutional Court that says that even if you are married out of community of property with no accrual, if you have contributed to the growth of your spouse's estate, so whether you worked in his business or you entertained his business partners,
providing him with human use resources by way of giving birth,
and all sorts
non-tangible contributions.
very often when parties start out in life, the business is small, and the husband and wife pull up their shirt sleeves and they start they're helping each other. They are the bookkeeper, they're the secretary, they're the receptionist, they're the cleaner. They do everything together until it's no longer required and the business grows. And so if you've contributed in any way, or you stay home, you look after the kids, you provide a situation where the husband can invest in the business,
up to spend his time in the business.
You've contributed both in terms of time, in terms of labor. It doesn't need to be a financial contribution. And the courts have said if you can prove that, then they will allow for what is called a redistribution. So you can get a portion of his estate that you have assisted and helped in that growth of the estate. And the third option in South African law is out of community of property with accrual. And the accrual is a system where you create a joint kitty. You start off and saying, this is the line in the sand, we are getting married, and from this date we are now going to have this joint kitty, the accrual. And at the end, unfortunately, on death or divorce, that accrual is calculated. And it's a great system because it provides for equity in the marriage. So if you look at the first scenario that I've mentioned, it automatically happens. So you'll have the husband who's bought the house, he's bought the car, he's bought the holiday home, he's got the business, but the wife then gets, you do a calculation of that accrual and you subtract the bigger amount, which is, let's say, for instance, the husband's estate, and you deduct it from the wife's estate, and let's just say hypothetically that's a very small amount, right? And you divide that by 2, and it creates equity in that marriage because she then gets the growth from the period that they were living together.
Yes.
And in that system, you don't share liabilities.
No. You have your separate estate.
The accrual only what you've accumulated.
That's right.
Okay.
So you can still have your separate estates and you have this concept of accrual, right? So let's move away now and let's talk about the Muslim marriage contract.
How that fits in.
And how that fits into this picture. Now, Muslim marriages are out of community of property with no accrual. So that's the first system I was talking about.
That's the default.
No. It's the out of community of property with no accrual. So I spoke about the two systems when you enter into an antenuptial contract. So it's the first one. Right?
So generally, historically, Islamically, if you entered a nikah, then what's yours is yours and what's mine is mine. That's how it's always been understood.
That's how it's been. Correct.
Right? But now, going forward, if you conclude a Muslim marriage and antenuptial,
and you then, like the South African law, will be entitled to a redistribution in terms of what you've contributed during the course of the marriage. Right? So it is a good way. So if you are concerned about whether your antenuptial contract is Islamic, it is in line with Islamic provisions. And what we can also do is take the Muslim marriage that Fatima was talking about and merge that with the antenuptial contract.
The conditions that we explained, the mahar,
it is possible.
Yes.
So you put all of that into a contract.
That's right.
All right. And so you can put anything into your contract provided it's not illegal.
Yeah.
Right. So you can include the concept of a mahar. You can include the concept of a delegated mahar. A deferred mahar, my apologies, right? To provide that financial security that Fatima was talking about. You can include the delegated talaq in your antenuptial contract. You can include the concept of mediation in your antenuptial contract. So you can merge these two contracts.
Right. That's so interesting. And I think right at the very beginning when we started these conversations, and Fatima with yourself also as well. When we introduced you to our listeners, it was exactly saying, let's establish the fact that you've studied on both sides as well. So this idea around that there's congruence, that it's possible.
Absolutely.
That it's not about
They're not
saying
mutually exclusive.
Exactly, because we do have to consider, as we said, South African law trumps everything, but it needn't be a case that one has to compromise one's values and beliefs as
Muslims.
a Muslim
That's
woman.
right.
It's just that we need to open up our minds and understand that some things may be done slightly differently to what we conventionally used to.
That's right.
But those conventions
Absolutely.
have anyway been created by a particular community. So we can dismantle some of them which are not of benefit to all. And as we said, more often than not, it's beneficial to male. It suits the males within our community. I know we didn't want to make this a question and answer session, but if you don't mind, I want to read some of these, and then you see which ones of those. I have my own questions, but then if either of you would like to pick up, I'm gonna go through all of them, and then afterwards you two can pick which ones you would like to respond to. This listener is asking, at which point do I ask for those talaq rights? That's of course the talaq tafweed that you mentioned. This listener is saying, Assalamu alaikum, if you're married in COP, your husband has business debt, is the wife liable for his debt after his demise? Is there any way for the wife to revoke this marriage of being in community of property besides going through divorce? That's our second question. The third one is more comment. This listener is saying, I'm happy to see, Assalamu alaikum to your guest, Khadija. I'm happy to see finally the contractual marriage rights are being a bit more accepted within the Muslim community. I don't know so much about whether it's completely accepted, but I think our guests are saying, let's pick up this conversation. This listener says, my daughter got married 30 years ago and there was so much opposition to a contract as well as her even being present in the mosque. Today, alhamdulillah, it's become a lot more acceptable. I, as a mom, will never ever forget the hostility we were met with in the mosque. Shukran for this conversation. This final one that I'm going to read is this listener says, Assalamu alaikum. If you married 22 years ago, we married Muslim right. Does that mean we automatically married in a community of property? So I'm going to leave it there and I'm going to ask if you want to pick up on any of those questions.
I'll do the first and the last. Okay. Right?
Okay.
And then Kamala can do. So the first question was, when can I ask for the talaq tafweed? Mm-hmm. Ideally, you should ask it before you get married, because then you're in the strongest bargaining position.
Okay.
Right? Once you are talking about getting married and you're all in love, you have a far greater persuasive power to convince your future spouse, who's very in love at that point, to convince him, I think for equality and equity reasons, I'd like you to delegate the right. You're going to have the right of talaq. I would like it too. So can we please agree in our contract that you will delegate the right to me unconditionally? However, that being said, you can ask for it afterwards as well. During your marriage, you can ask your husband to delegate the right of talaq tafweed to you. But it has to be a very, it will be far harder for you, obviously, to convince, unless the husband is somebody
because then it sounds as if there's something else at
That's
play.
right. Especially if you're going through difficulty. Can you imagine you're asking him to delegate?
Yes.
There's no incentive for him to do it at that stage. Your bargaining. That's
Yes,
right.
of course.
So that's why I encourage women, do it at the start, long before your nikah, and you discuss all these things and ask the husband to delegate the right to you.
And
but
you
that doesn't
mentioned
preclude you to do your ability to do it afterwards.
But the husband or the husband's delegation has the right to refuse, to decline, to...
Of course, he always has the right to refuse, and that's why you try and bargain for that before your marriage. You say, this is the condition of of us getting married, is that you delegate the right to me.
I also think a very important aspect within that is when we speak about within our communities, and of course what's encouraged as Muslim families, that it's families that come together.
That's right.
So one realizes, in case one thinks about it as, you standing there and you have to address this potential bridegroom, this can be something that as families, you say,
yes,
that
of
one
course.
can discuss.
And that's why I always say that that's the role of your wakil. It's not only on the day of the marriage to make the offer, in the mosque. It's to negotiate this process on your behalf.
Okay.
That is the role of your wakil.
Okay.
If you don't feel the strong enough or courageous enough, or you feel intimidated by the whole, then ask your father or whoever your wakil is to negotiate these terms for you. The last question was, I was married 22 years ago. Is my Islamic marriage automatically in community of property? No. If you didn't go have your marriage, didn't get a civil marriage at the Department of Home Affairs, then your marriage is still regarded as a Islamic marriage, which is out of community of property.
Okay.
Which means what's yours is yours and what's your husband's is your husband's.
Okay, so then the listener further asks, what do I do? What do we do now to get this ANC done, to get the anti-nuptial contract done?
So what you can do is enter into a post-nuptial contract.
Okay.
And that means, unfortunately, it is an application to court, and you say to the court, I wasn't aware, I didn't understand, and you ask the court's permission to authorize the change of matrimonial regime.
Okay.
So it's certainly possible. Unfortunately, it's not the cheapest process. But because you have to give notice to all your creditors, and you allow your creditors to object. And if there are properties, you need to deal with all of that. You need to get reports from the Registrar of Deeds. And so it is a comprehensive application to court, but it is possible. And the consequences after that is that you're going to have that security.
Of course. Of course. And I think you mentioned that, Kamila, and I think, Fatima, it's also important that we remind our listeners that our guests, even though they are experts in the areas, they are not here to give legal advice per se. These are just broad guidelines, and the reason why we raise these questions that all of our listeners have sent in, because it gives them a basis from which to address, of course, what are burning questions within our community. It gives us a sense of that. So we just want to be clear about that. You do need to seek professional assistance. You do need to speak to a lawyer so that all of the relevant facts and all of the facts are taken into account. I think it's just really important that we mention that to our listeners. But Kamila, you also wanted to respond to one or two of the other questions.
Khadija, if you could just refresh my memory as to one of the questions.
So this one asked so about the debt. If there's a wife liable for the debt, is there any way for the wife to revoke this marriage besides going through divorce? I think that's essentially what the listener is saying. But after his demise. So I don't know if that's sufficient information for you to go on.
It's unfortunately not enough information, because you need to look at things like the will. You need to look at things like what is in the estate. There's a lot of nuances to that question that I don't know, and I can't properly answer it without knowing more information.
But then just on that note, I mean, going on what the listener is asking, so if one has been married in community of property, oh my gosh, I can't believe we've run out of time. We have about 2 minutes left, so we quickly get this in. If going on what this listener is saying, if a husband passes away but there's business debt and they are married in community of property, who's responsible for that debt?
Well, it depends on whether that business debt was in an entity. There's a whole range of factors. If it's in a PTY Limited, was there security in place? I mean, what about key man insurance policies?
Yes.
What about if he was a sole proprietor? Yes, then it would be a very different scenario. And then yes, she would unfortunately be liable for the debt. So there's a lot of things,
a whole range of variables
that I don't know, and I can't really answer. But
so I'm going to quickly ask you then, Kamila, perhaps we have about 2 minutes left, and I think I can give each of you a minute perhaps to just give your concluding remarks on the topic that we addressed today, these marriage contracts.
I would strongly encourage all the Muslim listeners out there to seek legal advice when you are getting married. Both seek advice both from your imam or your sheikh, but also seek legal advice from an attorney that specializes in drafting anti-nuptial contracts and Muslim marriages. It is an imperative and such a crucial step in your life. please. And people often think that, oh, it's going to cost me money to do this. It's also going to cost you money to buy the flowers and to get the dress and to get everything else ready. This is far more important, right? Spend that few rands in getting proper advice and to provide security for the rest of your life.
And it also sets you up, you're educated about what you're going into.
Absolutely.
And I mean, just reinforcing what Kamila was saying, and then of course that is what the Muslim Family Law Hub was about, is to educate and advocate for more equitable Muslim family law outcomes. And the website provides you, under the marriage resource tab, not only the Q&A about the issues under Islamic marriages and South African marriages, but we also have a resource tab where we recommend various legal service providers who can possibly assist you with an anti-nuptial contract. And I would highly recommend that our listeners actually go onto the website, and especially for those who are about to enter the journey of marriage, to seriously consider, as Kamila said, concluding a anti-nuptial contract, which will include the conditions of a Muslim marriage contract.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have no excuse nowadays. We have this Muslim Family Law Hub. We have access to this type of information. So let's educate ourselves. As our guests have said, it's the most important contract that you will ever enter into. Be educated. Do your research. Go to www.muslimfamilylawhub.org and go and look at the website and familiarize yourself with the website. Fatima and Kamila, what a pleasure and privilege. Shukran so much for joining us today.
Shukran. Khadija.
Thanks for having me.
Walaikum salam.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.